Welcome to the New Money Habits podcast, where we talk about how to create a better plan for your money so you don't have to live paycheck to paycheck. Here are your hosts, Sarah Jones and Nino Villa.
Welcome back, Budgeteers. Coach Nino Villa here alongside me. It is Sarah Jones, my partner on the airways. How you doing?
Hello. Hello, Nino. Hello to everyone out there.
Where are you joining us from today, Sarah?
Oh, Nino, we are still in Texas. But can I just say, and I think this is going to tie in fairly nicely to our conversation today, but I don't want to necessarily glamorize this RV life because there are a lot of challenges and a lot of unexpected things that happen while you live in a mobile traveling home. And just this past week, we are dealing with 2 water leaks, one that's pretty significant that we have to get fixed. My washing machine has thrown some codes with the panel. We need some new tires. So I just want to say that even though you plan for these things, being a full-time RVer is not all that glamorous. And so if I'm anything, I am honest and upfront with people. And so while it's awesome, there's still a lot of challenges and you really have to plan for these things. And it's not cheaper to live in an RV versus a home or versus renting.
Interesting.
Which a lot of people think it is. And I'm here to tell you, it's not.
I would have thought that until you and I had some conversations and I realized, oh, wait, yeah, you got to pull that thing everywhere. So you're burning up more gas and gas prices are outrageous. And tires, because those are going to wear on you and you need to replace those pretty frequently. And so like park fees, because, you might not want to just post up in a Walmart parking lot and you might want to actually go somewhere. And so until we started talking about it, I'm like, yeah, right. There's all these other expenses. Maybe not as cheap or, as inexpensive as one might think.
It's true. And I think a lot of times I've seen people sell their home so they could live in an RV thinking it was going to be cheaper. And to that, I've got some other questions. Maybe a mortgage is more affordable. Maybe it's not. Maybe renting. Who knows?
Which is a great segue into our conversation today because we are going to talk about mortgages and affordability and what it means to be able to afford a mortgage and all of that stuff. And so we're going to kind of start at the absolute beginning because they say the beginning is a great place to start. But I don't want to assume that our listeners, I don't want to assume anything. I want to kind of assume that we're all starting at ground zero. And so I kind of just want to build the conversation from that point. And so I know for me, when I first heard the term mortgage, I was probably in my teens or early 20s. When I heard the word, it sounded like lots of money. I don't know why, but it's just a mortgage. Like, oh, that's got to be really expensive. So let's start with what is a mortgage? And a mortgage is simply a loan to buy property. Mostly, typically, a house. It could be other things like commercial property or whatever. But a mortgage is just a loan type. And that loan is used to buy property, like a house. So then I want to make sure that all of our listeners know what goes into that loan. So like any loan, there are factors. But for a mortgage, there are 3 major factors. The first major factor is how much you are actually borrowing or financing. The second factor is the interest rate. So how much it's going to cost you to borrow that money, right? The bank gets to say, hey, we're going to charge you this much to borrow our money. And then the third factor is the loan term. So how long you have to pay that loan. And with mortgages, with a home, you typically get a much longer period of time than you might be used to on something like a car. A car loan is usually 4 or 5 years. A mortgage, nowadays, I think most people take a 30-year mortgage. but anywhere between 15 and 30 years to pay that loan back. So a mortgage is just a loan about how much you're borrowing, what the interest rate is, and how long you're borrowing that money, or how long you have to pay it back. That is what a mortgage is.
I know for a fact that when I got my first mortgage, I was 20 years old when I bought my first home. And it was not explained to me. Now, not saying I'm not glad I did it, but these things were not broken down for me, even though I was looking for a house, and I ended up purchasing my first house when I turned 20 years old. But I love that we're going through this because I certainly didn't know when I was looking, even though I was getting a mortgage, these things were not fully broken down for me. So I love that we're sharing this information, and because you know what? People may not know out there.
Yep. The other thing I didn't know until I was much older, and I was very upset with my father about this. So my father had owned a number of homes during my childhood years, and even before I was born. And so he understood home ownership, and he understood mortgages and the benefits and the drawbacks between that and renting, but he never explained any of this to me. It wasn't until I was much, much older when I realized one of the houses my dad bought when I was in my teen years, he purchased it for about $45,000. And if you can imagine, a mortgage on $45,000 is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 to $400 a month. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about how you calculate that in a minute. I realized him charging me $200 a month for room and board, I was paying half his mortgage. I didn't know it at the time, but many, many, many years later, I realized, wow, I was paying half the mortgage. And it wasn't until then that I realized that sometimes, depending on, where you are and like location wise, right? This was all in Buffalo, New York, where I eventually rented an apartment on my own for $400 a month. And I didn't realize at the time, like, wait a minute, for the same amount of money every month, I could have bought a house. So sometimes you don't realize that like renting and a mortgage payment can be very, very similar in the amount that they cost every month.
Yeah. And I think that, when I was looking for my first house, I didn't have a whole lot of information to go off of. My parents never owned a home. And so the house that I grew up in, that we lived in for many years, was part of my dad's pay for the job that he had, right? And so we didn't even have rent necessarily. It was just, that was part of his pay, right? Part of his income was housing with his job. And a lot of people in my family, we didn't talk about money a lot. I didn't hear, a lot of different things growing up. And so the things that I heard about mortgages, number one, weren't all that stellar, to be honest. But what I wanted is I just thought I want something of my own. I got kind of tired of renting. But I ended up, my mortgage was a little bit less than my rent, but the costs turned out to be a lot higher in my situation.
Yes. And so there's where that conversation between renting and purchasing a home really kind of begins, is in understanding, like, not only what is that monthly cost, but then what responsibilities do I have when I'm renting and what responsibilities do I have when I own, because those are incredibly different, right? So what are some of the differences? What did you learn early on? Like, oh, I'm responsible for that.
Well, one thing, and actually this is a quote that I heard recently, and I wish I would have heard it years ago, but it says, if you can't afford to rent, you can't afford to buy. And I thought, wow, I left renting because I could get a mortgage, right? My first house I paid $86,000 for, my first little home. And, my mortgage was less than rent payment was. But what I didn't realize is roofs are really expensive to put on a home. When your roof leaks and you don't have an insurance, it's not an insurance claim, it's almost $15,000, right? That wouldn't have been the case had I been renting it. Hot water heater leaks, upgrades, remodels, just yard maintenance, there's so many, I could go on forever. All the expenses that a house can have a mortgage that you might not be responsible for rent. Some of the big ones were utilities. When I rented, not all of the utilities were my responsibility. Some of our utilities, the landlord paid. So when I got a mortgage, I not only had the mortgage, I had those utilities plus upkeep, plus insurance. I mean, it started kind of to add up.
Yeah, I think when I'm working with first-time home buyers, people considering buying for the first time, I want to help them to remember. And so if that's you listening right now, I want to help you to remember that there are a slew of expenses that, although you're paying rent and your rent might be a little bit higher than a mortgage payment would be, there are a slew of expenses that are just not your responsibility. When that hot water heater breaks and needs to be replaced, and you're the renter, not your responsibility. When your microwave breaks and it needs to be replaced, not your responsibility. When the AC goes out, not your responsibility. When a pipe leaks, not your responsibility. Like all of these things that you get to call either the property management company or the landlord themselves and say, hey, this thing needs to be fixed, not your responsibility to pay for that. So what I like to remind new first-time homebuyers is that when you're walking into not only the mortgage, you're walking into a ton of responsibility, things that are now on you to upkeep and repair and replace and that sort of thing. And so not being hasty about jumping into a mortgage. I was working with a young couple who had jumped into home ownership kind of hastily, and they found, like, because the property that they purchased was more than 50 years old, it needed a lot of work and all these things. And they made the radical decision after about working together for about 8 months or so and really kind of talking back and forth. They just came to the decision. They're like, you know what? We're going to sell, rent for a little while, kind of hit the reset button. And when we buy the next time, we're going to do it right. We're going to have some money in the bank and all these different things that they didn't do the first time. And all these years later, they own a home again, but they did it the right way. And now, instead of it feeling like this burden, that now it's a blessing. So
I love that. And I want to throw out there too that there's nothing wrong with renting. Not everybody needs to own a home. That was one of the reasons why I got my first home, is because I thought that was the grown-up thing to do. That was the right thing to do. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't at the time. A lot was going on in my life. I was 20 years old. But I talk with so many people that they're like, it makes me feel like an adult to own my own home. And the truth of the matter is, Nino, is owning your own home does not mean that you're more successful. Doesn't mean that you're better off financially. It doesn't mean that you're more of an adult than somebody else. It doesn't mean any of that. It means that you're making that decision to own a home, or you are making the decision to rent. I know people that have rented their entire lives and absolutely love it, right? And so I just want to throw that out there. I know that's not exactly what we're talking about, but I just want people to know it's okay to rent. And if you're doing it for the right reasons, again, and you're being intentional with it, then it's the right decision for you, and you don't have to have a mortgage. So I just want to throw that out there, because I think, mortgages are pushed a lot, and home ownership is pushed a lot. And I just want to say, you know what, sometimes renting, let somebody else handle all the hassles and I'll rent.
Yeah. I want to echo that sentiment, because I think what I've noticed too, working with all generations, what you really have to ask yourself is, are you establishing roots? If you're going to establish roots somewhere and you're going to be somewhere for a while, then it probably benefits you to eventually buy, because now you have an asset that's almost like a forced savings account. I mean, I bought my house 13 years ago because I knew I was going to build some roots, right? I bought it for 119. I could easily put it on the market today for 380. It was a forced savings account. I now have this asset, and that was a great position for me. But what I noticed working with all generations is there are people who, traveling nurse or a young professional who wants to make themselves available to any company, and maybe they can't work from home. So it's all like, hey, I currently live in Arizona, but I need to be able to relocate to the state of Washington in a heartbeat. And that's a lot easier to do when you're renting. Then when you get to the new place that you're unfamiliar with, renting allows you to get familiar with a neighborhood without completely locking yourself into it. There's just so much more flexibility there. So I echo that sentiment that, buying a home is not always the best option. Sometimes renting is the wiser decision depending on your circumstances.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And I wish I would have made some money off my first house. I, in fact, lost money after being there for 10 years. I had to pay to get out of it. Sold it for less than what I bought it for. So, but
you must have sold around 2008 to 2010, something like that.
It was. But, again, how you can't predict those. And this is just another reminder, right? That it's not always, real estate can be a really great investment, but it's not always, because we can't always predict, the future. And for us, it was the right time to move. Like we needed to move. But I think this is just a good reminder that sometimes housing and being a homeowner comes with some really big challenges, right? That we have to deal with. And for me, one of those was having to pay to get out of that first home when I sold it. Something that if I were renting, it wouldn't have been an issue, right? You put in your notice and you go. So again, there's pros and cons to all of it.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about affordability. This is a topic I'm going to forewarn our listeners. I'm probably going to get a little passionate, a little heated about affordability, just because I want to see people succeed, and I know that the banks don't have that same mindset. They are about making their money, and so they don't care about affordability the way I care about affordability. So let's talk a little bit about, how do you know how much house you can afford and what your mortgage payment should be? How do you calculate a mortgage payment? I mean, I don't want to get down into too many nitty-gritties on an audio podcast, but at the same time, I want to have the conversation about affordability and how one figures out what can I afford and all of that.
And I think it's good numbers to know, because again, this wasn't something that was really fully gone through. Both times that I've owned two homes, I was a lot savvier the second go around than I was the first go around, but it astonished me how much I was approved for, Nino. And when I look at that, I'm thinking, you're approving me for how much? How much are you saying I can afford each month? There is no way I could make that kind of a mortgage payment, right? So I'm really happy that we're going to go through some of these numbers, because I want people, again, to realize that just because what you're approved for does not mean that's what you have to spend. And it's about knowing your numbers, right? And being really comfortable with borrowing wisely and being really comfortable with what you're doing.
Yeah, so let me start the conversation with what the banks will do to you and how they'll take advantage of you. And then we can back our way into wise borrowing. But so a bank whose sole interest is making money, they've been around for decades, and they've figured out all of these numbers, and they kind of know like what the breaking point is, and they're willing to approve people for the breaking point. And so I think once upon a time you could get approved for as much as say like 50% of your take-home pay, and they realized that was a really bad idea. So they backed that down to like the 40s. And what they really figured out is it's about 36%. A bank is comfortable looking at somebody's household income, breaking that down into what they make monthly, and saying, yeah, they can afford to as much as 36% of their take-home pay. And while that percentage might sound like, oh, that's only about a third, anytime you're spending that much of your take-home pay on just the mortgage, this is not the utilities. This is not putting food on the table. This is not your car payment if you have one of those and your car insurance. And it's none of it. It is just your mortgage payment. And when it's over a third, you are in for trouble. Things are going to be tight, but the bank doesn't care. So they're like, yeah, we know people will pay the payment because it's their home. So we will approve you for this much. Now you might be asking yourself, wait. Like, I don't even know how much I make a month. And so what is 36% of what I make? I don't even know. Here's what you need to know. With the interest rates the way they are right now, over 6%, this is about 3.5 times your annual household income. When interest rates were less than 6% a few years ago, that would have been like 4 times your annual salary. Now, let me break that down a little bit more. The average household income today is $67,000. So at $67,000, if the bank is willing to give you about 4 times that amount to buy a house, they're saying, we will allow you to finance, we will allow you to borrow $268,000 from us. And I just think that's way too much. We'll talk about what wise borrowing looks like in a moment, but let me kind of pause there. Sarah, go ahead.
Oh, geez. I mean, what is there to say? There's so much to say here. It's, and I'm not going to bash the banking industry or anything because, they're in it. There's reasons, but there are reasons why they are still in business, right? They are making money off of this. That is their main goal. They don't care about you. We care about you doing things that are right for your money, right? So to all the listeners out there, we care and we want you to do things that are beneficial for you. To spend that, to be approved for that kind of money, I just think that you limit yourself and you take away so many choices and you put so much stress on yourself if you are willing to spend what you are approved for. 4 times your annual salary feels ridiculous to me.
And I would agree that it is ridiculous. And here's why. Right? So I'm a total math nerd. I like to crunch a bunch of numbers. And so in preparation for our conversation, I was like, there's some numbers I need to know. One of those numbers I needed to know is over the decades, what was the ratio of average household income to average home price? And so I started back in 1950, and the ratio is just a smidge above 2 to 1. What I mean by that is back in 1950, the average household income was $3,300 for the entire year. Could you imagine living off of $3,300 for the entire year? But you could also buy a home in 1950. The average house sold for $7,600. Mm-hmm. So just a smidge above 2 to 1, right? Just a little over double. And that hangs true for 1960, 1970, 1980, like 2 to 1, 2 to 1, 2 to 1, 2 to 1. Now, interestingly, I couldn't find the numbers for like 2023 right now because everything's all over the place. But trust me when I say, like in my neighborhood in Buckeye, Arizona, just outside of Phoenix, I know that the median household income for this community is around $70,000. And I know that home prices start at $300,000. Mm-hmm. 70 doubled is 140. 4 times is 280, and it's still more than 4 times the average household income in this community. That drives me nuts.
Mm-hmm. It's putting people in very vulnerable situations, right? It's putting people in situations where they might have to choose between putting food on their table or making their mortgage payment, right? Like it's now we need a second, a third, and a fourth income to cover all of our expenses. I think it's sick that this is the way things have turned out, with and there was a period of time where I don't remember exactly what James and I were making per year at this. And it was about 2010. I'm going to say it was about $60,000 a year. Maybe it was a little bit less. I honestly don't remember. But we had the mortgage on the one house, and we got approved for another house. I thought it was selling the one, right, and get approved for this new one to buy. No, they approved us to carry both mortgages, which would have totaled at that time right around $300,000. And actually, I think we were making a little under 60. I think it was closer to about 50,000 at that time. And both mortgages would have been right around 300,000. That's what they were. And I was like, whoa, hold on a second. And in my brain, just because it's who I am and I lived in scarcity mode, like I'm like, there's no way in heck we could do that, right? But I had the wherewithal to say, no, I can see what this is. But I work with people all the time that are in mortgages, Nino, that quite frankly, they can't afford right now.
Yeah.
They absolutely cannot afford. And while I love that you love your home, something needs to change with this industry. And we need to start, I think it actually starts with us. It's not going to start with the banking industry. I think it needs to start with us individually to say, listen, I want to do things differently for myself. And I want to show others that they can do it differently too.
Yeah. Yeah. So just kind of bringing back the point that, so the bank in your situation was willing to approve you for almost 6 times your annual income. They do 4 times like it's nothing.
Yeah.
And historically, your best bet is to be at like this 2-to-1 ratio. Now, so that means you shouldn't really spend more than double. Now, I'm gonna take a little bit of liberty with that, and I'm gonna say if you spend between 2 and 3 times your annual salary, you are going to be in this much more comfortable zone that it ends up being about 25 to 28% of your take-home pay, and that's very reasonable. Like 1/4 of your income versus 1/3, okay. But again, when you go out shopping for a home, who's doing all the calculations to figure out, like, this is how much I make a year, this is how much I bring home a month, this is 1/4 of that? Like, you don't do that calculation. So when interest rates are low, you can afford 3 times your annual salary. But when interest rates are high, like they are now, over 6%, you're better off to stay at like 2.5 times your annual salary. So I go back to, if I make $67,000 a year, I really can afford somewhere between 140 and 210. Not even 210, low 200s. So it's that area of like 140 to $200,000 is the comfortable spot. Now, that's how much you're actually borrowing from the bank. If you're planning on putting a large down payment and you have like 40 grand in the bank, well, now your 200 becomes 240 because you're still only going to borrow the 200, but you can buy a house for 240. But so often I find myself talking to people and they don't even, I didn't know what my budget really was the first time I bought a home. When I bought this home, I was making somewhere between $60,000 and $65,000 a year at that time. And I didn't know any of these calculations, none of them. My sister, who happens to be in the mortgage business and she underwrites mortgages, I was like, what do you think? And she's all like, let's get you pre-approved for $90,000. Okay. Like, I didn't know, I had no other expertise to go off of at the time. So it was like, all right, let's do that. So got pre-approved for 90. My friend told me about this particular community that I bought in, Spec Homes, 2010. The house was built in 2008. So by 2010, it had lost value, right? And so I could buy it cheaper than what they originally wanted to sell it for. But it was still 119. Well, 119 is 30 grand more than I was pre-approved for. And the approval for 120 came back like it was nothing. Like, yeah, 120, sure, no problem. Because what I didn't realize at the time is that because I was making, let's say it was 60, they would have easily approved me like for 240, four times, right? So at 120, I was that was twice, that's two times, that's that ratio that's really comfortable. And it was because my mortgage payment, principal and interest only, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but principal and interest was like $650 a month. Where was I going to live for $650 a month? Now, what I didn't realize is all the stuff I realize now. Like, hold on, there's principal and interest and homeowners insurance and taxes and the HOA. And oh, by the way, now you're responsible for all the utilities. You're Thankfully, it was I bought a brand new home or a brand new built home, right? So it came under warranty and all that stuff. But other than that, I would have had a lot of other responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. And, I think that that's where kind of the gap falls in a lot of times between renting versus owning is all of those unexpected. So yes, maybe you feel like you can't afford the mortgage, right? But then it's all these other things that come in. So if you're getting a mortgage and you're looking at that payment, right? And you're like, ooh, boy, I don't know, that's looking pretty tight. If you feel it's looking pretty tight, then it's not a good fit for you. So I know Nino's the math nerd here. He goes through all the big numbers and I'm the feelings kind of girl, right? And I'm just like, if your gut is telling you that this doesn't feel good, then you need to listen to that because there are so many more expenses that come along with it. This isn't a don't do it kind of speech. This is be aware of what you're doing and please understand that there are a lot more things that come along. Things will happen in your home that need to be replaced, right? Things are going to happen that you're not going to be able to put off or that maybe you can't put on a credit card or there's just so many things that happen. I'm going to tell a quick little story here because it's very funny. It's relevant. And there's a piece of it that isn't, but when James and I started dating, and he was going to move in, I owned my house. And so he was renting and moved in with me. And to get renter's insurance, his insurance agent needed to come out and inspect the property so he could get renter's insurance. Well, the agent was there and was going around. He said, "Oh, looks like the roof here needs to be replaced. Is the homeowner going to replace that?" And I looked at him like, "No, this homeowner is not going to replace that." Because I didn't have the $15,000 that it was going to cost at that time to replace the roof on the house and the garage, right? And so it's your renters. There's so many things that go into owning a home. I'm just going to leave it there because I keep repeating it, but I want to just hit that point home for people, right? That there's just a lot of stuff that goes into it. He ended up getting his renter's insurance. He moved in. Nothing was damaged. Homeowner did end up replacing the roof in a couple of years. We got it all taken care of, but it's just goes to show that I tried to put it off, right? And he almost wasn't able to get renter's insurance because there were repairs that needed to be done, and I couldn't afford to do them.
Yep. I think it's a good point to make, though, because even though I bought a new build that had never been lived in and was under warranty, the moment I walked in, there was a clause in the homeowner or the HOA, so the homeowners association, talked about how you have to have window dressings on all of your windows. And there were no curtains, there were no blinds. So the moment I walked in, I was like, ooh, I have about 20 windows I need to put something on. Otherwise, I'm going to start getting fined from the homeowners association for not having window dressings on the windows. So, it doesn't matter if it's a 100-year-old house that's going to need new plumbing and electric, or a brand new build that's going to need blinds or curtains. When you walk into owning a home, and the other thing is, we moved from maybe a 1,200 square foot apartment, which is actually kind of a big apartment if you think about it, but from a 1,200 square foot apartment into a 2,000 square foot house. We didn't have enough furniture to fill the place up. So now you're buying more furniture because I got, that fourth bedroom, that's going to be an awesome man cave that then turns into the home office. But, so it goes through some changes. But yeah, home ownership means a little bit different than what it means to rent. And so I like the quote from earlier: if you can't afford to rent, you can't afford to buy. And so, and I agree, like if the numbers don't feel right, if it's like, wow, you would approve me for that much, and I can, like, the bank says I can afford that much, but if your internal gut is kind of sounding an alarm, like that's like half of everything you bring home every month. Listen to it and borrow wisely instead of borrowing according to the bank. 2, maybe 3 times your annual salary, but don't do the 4, 5, or even 6 times that the bank will approve you for. It will hurt.
It will. And you're probably going to end up with some regrets with that, right? Don't add stress onto your life. Being a homeowner, I think, is not supposed to be stressful necessarily, right? It's a move that a lot of us want to feel really proud of and happy about, right? And so if there's a lot of stress and overwhelm that comes with that, then you're really kind of defeating the purpose of it, right? And so that's where it's important to honor yourself, give yourself the gift of, hey, if this doesn't feel right, then this one isn't right for me. And I know there's going to be something else that's going to come along that's going to fit much, much better.
Yep. All right. So great conversation as always. If you are listening to this episode and you're thinking, boy, I need to, learn more about mortgages and what I can truly afford and what's the sweet spot and how much house is enough house without being too much house and all that stuff. I want to encourage you to visit the website, newmoneyhabits.com. We have a mortgage calculator that you can use to help you kind of figure out what that number should look like. But then if you need to talk to somebody about purchasing wisely and going about it the right way, schedule that free call with either Sarah or myself, and we'll help you figure out, what's the best way to go about acquiring that dream of home ownership. Because if that's the dream, right? Home ownership is the dream. There are different paths to it, and sometimes, taking a little bit of a detour to get to the final destination works out better.
It's true. And a home doesn't, maybe your home's on wheels. There's nothing wrong with that either, right?
That's right. All right. Well, great conversation as always, and we'll continue ours next time.
Thank you for listening to the New Money Habits podcast, brought to you by New Money Habits and Keeping Up with the Joneses Financial Coaching. Submit your questions to our host by emailing podcast@newmoneyhabits.com. Be sure to subscribe to be notified of future episodes. Join our growing group of like-minded people on Facebook and follow us on your favorite platform. Music provided by Summer School.